Welcome back to the class. In this lecture, we will focus on Chicano culture. I want to explore Chicano popular culture, but not only just tell you about, oh, this is part of Chicano culture, or, these are different elements. I want to give you a very kind of academic argument as to how Western society views culture versus the way Mexican Americans perceive it. So, and how we challenge Western perceptions of, high, low, and folk culture. So I'll talk about that more in a minute. So in this lecture, we will look at music, art, and just different aspects of Chicano life. Now, it's impossible to cover every aspect of Chicano culture, so we're only going to touch on a few. But hopefully, these examples kind of show you not only what are some elements of Chicano culture, and some of you might be very familiar where it might seem like second nature, but also show you how Chicano artists challenge this notion that there is a hierarchical element to culture that has been created by the Western world. So first, let's look at some objectives. As you can see, there's some pictures over here. You see Day of the Dead, which is something that many of you might celebrate, has definitely grown in popularity in the last decade with a film like Coco. But for the most part, it was very specific to a community. Even within Mexico, different parts celebrated maybe more than others. I know if you go down to Oaxaca, it's very popular. Where maybe in other parts of Mexico, it might not have been as popular. Growing up, we never really celebrated Day of the Dead. And the other image shows Chicano tattoo. So there is a style when it comes to tattooing that's almost very specific to Mexican Americans. There's a whole history to that. There's actually a great documentary that talks about when it came about. But again, it's something that's very specific to a community, but eventually becomes very mainstream. So some of the goals for this lecture is number one, to provide a kind of working definition of culture and cultural production. And this is a very kind of Western definition. And as I said earlier, we're going to challenge that idea of the Western definition of culture. Number two, we're going to discuss the function of cultural categories. Why did Western society create such hierarchical structure when it comes to culture? These things don't come just because we need to put things into categories. There's an element of power where one culture is valued more than a different culture. And, our goal is to show you different aspects of Chicano culture. Again, I'm not going to exhaust every aspect of Chicano culture, but we will talk about a few. Just for you, those of you that are not familiar, will walk out saying, "Oh, I didn't know that this was part of Chicano culture." Like I said, maybe some of you didn't know that there was such a thing as Chicano tattoos, and again, this is a great example of that. And as I noted earlier, that we're going to kind of challenge these categories that Western society has created when it comes to culture, and we're going to see how Chicano cultural production breaks them down essentially because it doesn't really fit into these specific categories that Western society has created. So let's begin by looking at how Western society has defined different aspects of culture. First, we have high culture, and as the name kind of indicates, it's definitely associated with Western society, where it categorizes certain aspects of Western culture as better than other aspects. Below that, you have low culture, and we'll talk about how we define low culture. We have something called folk culture, and lastly, mass culture, right? So these are maybe some categories that you might be familiar with if you've taken an anthropology class. And we're going to look at how Western society, right, kind of European, Euro American culture has created this division in culture and, where we value one over a different one. So when it comes to high culture, activities that appeal to an educated and sophisticated audience is seen as better, as much more quote unquote refined because it's highly developed due to their aesthetics sensibilities. So again, this is something we're going to challenge. But when it comes to art, we have seen that we have defined certain art as superior to something that your kids draw, right? We could think of something like Pollock or Da Vinci or Michelangelo or Pablo Picasso, where it seems like you need to, in order to understand that art, you need to be well educated to truly appreciate it, right? Take an art history class or something like that. And again, this is a division that Western society has created. Um, but it's not just specific to art itself. You know, we could look at things like food. If you ever go to restaurants, right, most of you just go there to eat, right? You just think food is food, right? I'm happy I'm eating. And for many us Chicanos, you know, we go to the Olive Garden and we think like, oh man, we're eating fancy today, right? It must be somebody's birthday or maybe somebody graduated or something, right? But you know, even in food, where you know you go to restaurants where they have you know 7 to 12 courses of you know of your meal, right? They bring a plate after a plate after a plate. It's not the same food, right? It's a very kind of small bites. It's very kind of sophisticated type of food. You need a sophisticated palate to enjoy it. You know, even that gets associated with high culture. Now, that might be pricier, but I want you to understand that food, that price, that money is not always associated with high culture. Another example is wine, right? Can you tell the difference between a $10 bottle of wine versus a $500 bottle of wine? If you ever go wine tasting, right, these people swish the wine in their mouth and, you know, I don't know what they do with it, but eventually spit it out. And I'm like, oh, I thought wine was for drinking, right? So again, this notion that they have a very refined palate, that they can tell the difference between one wine and the other, and somehow they're better for it, right? These are things that we associate with high culture. So these are some examples, right? Going to the ballet, going to a classical music concert, going to the theater, right? Not the theater, not to the movies, but the theater, like in New York or something like that. Going to go watch some Shakespeare, going to a museum. All these things are associated with high culture. Now, understand that, again, money is not tied to high culture because some of these things could be relatively cheap, right? I've been to the ballet, I've been to classical music concerts. Some of them are free, right? At the park or something like that, or maybe you go to a church chorus. Um, or some of them are relatively cheap compared to some of the concerts you go to. So you could probably go to a classical music concert for under $50, whereas you know you go see Bad Bunny and Taylor Swift, and that could cost you maybe up to $200 to $500. So again, money is not always associated with high culture. Low culture is something that's viewed as attracting large numbers of consumers who are not well educated or aesthetically sophisticated. So this would be your regular Joe who has a 9 to 5 type of job, you know, cleaning toilets and I don't know, you know, working as a mechanic or whatever, right? They're not going to museums and ballets or something like that because they don't have the maybe the education to appreciate all that. That doesn't mean that's true. I'm just saying this is the way Western culture has defined these different things. So going to a sporting event, right? Watching soap operas, going to a rock and roll concert. Again, these are things that might not take a large amount of intellectual knowledge to watch, right? And understand that some of these things might be much more expensive than some of the things in high culture, right? Going to a museum, I guess for most of us, it's probably free or a couple bucks. Whereas going to sporting events, going to go watch the Cardinals play football, that could cost you up to maybe $200 to $500, right? So just again, money does not, as they say in the Western world, right? Money does not buy you class, right? So yeah, these things might be more expensive. Doesn't mean that Western society views it as better than these things over here, right? Folk culture is something that are practices of a small group within the larger society, which are not widespread throughout the community. So a lot of these things might include things like going to a Native American performance, right? Most of us do not participate in those things because it's not part of our culture. Other examples of folk culture, which could be something like even hip hop. If you were alive 40, 50 years ago where hip hop originated, like in places like New York, That is very folk, a great example of folk culture because it's very specific to a region, to an experience of a community of people. It was very political back in the 70s and 80s, right? If you ever heard the song The Message, right? But it was very specific to an experience to a particular group of people. If you listen to punk music, that's another example of folk culture, right? It's almost like a subculture. And again, that's 1970s and 1980s. But eventually, these things can branch out into the mainstream and become part of mainstream culture, and really into the next category, which is what we call mass culture. This is something that's produced by culture industries such as TV and advertising for mass consumption in order to keep buying products, right? Mass culture is created so you can buy. And it's accepting ideas that keep a capitalist economy strong and stable, right? This is really, to create jobs and really to create a market. So going back to our example of hip hop, this is something that was very folk, and by the 1990s, it became very mass produced, right? Pop music is a great example of that, where it's no longer has those, ties to its political message, but rather it's really there to talk about consuming certain goods. Like, they're rapping about Cristal and, Prada, whatever products they hope maybe to one day get or something like that, right? And there's a lot of articles that talk about the critique of hip hop culture from the 1990s forward, that it's really just about mass production, mass consumption. But it started very folky. So again, these are the different categories that Western society has more or less created. There's more, but again, for the sake of argument, we're going to focus on these ideas. All right, and not that there's anything wrong with any of them, but when it comes to Chicano culture, we're going to challenge this and say, well, yes, Chicano culture is folk culture, Chicano culture is low culture, mass culture, but also high culture. So even though Western society tries to devalue it and say, no, you belong in this particular category, we find that Chicano culture breaks that mold and will fit into all of these. So let's look at some examples of Chicano culture. We begin by looking at music, Chicano music. So this is not specific just to Mexican Americans, but we're also looking at Mexican music because those are our roots. So when we look at Mexican music, it's something that many Mexican Americans also listen to. So most of you are probably familiar with rancheras, right? These are songs over here. You have Vicente Fernandez, and maybe I'll have an activity where you look at some of these examples, so that way you can hear it. But canciones rancheras come from Mexico, right? It's not something that was produced on this side of the border, but because we're so connected to Mexico through our parents or grandparents, right, through that history, it is something that is very that we're very familiar with. Most of you have probably listened to this music at family events, right? Having a barbecue or carne asada in the backyard, music is playing, some chente is in the background, right? Or others might remember it when you're every Saturday you wake up in the morning and guess what? Time to clean the house, right? This music comes on. So La Canción Ranchera comes from Mexico. It's mostly from the state of Jalisco. And this is music, and again, I'll have some examples, like a playlist, so you can look at some of this stuff. But it uses a lot of instruments like violins, the harp, the guitar, the bass, and even trumpets. Right in the 1940s, they begin to add trumpets. These are great singers. Vicente Fernandez is one of them. Javier Solis and oh God, I can't remember his name, but there's other rancheras. It's a lot of different type of songs that they sing. Most of them tend to be love songs, though, and telling about a lot of times about a lost love, right? Trying to regain that person that left you. So it's also kind of great drinking music. So this is music that might not necessarily be Chicano, but it's definitely tied to our culture because of our parents. So I'm sure those of you that are Mexican American are very familiar with this genre. The next category that we have is the corrido. This actually originated as a romance song going back to Spain in the 18th century. So we're talking about 1700s, 1800s. But by the 1900s, during the Mexican Revolution, it really begins to take off because it's associated with really the northern part of Mexico and addresses the conflict with the politics of the Mexican Revolution. People talking about what was happening to them. Unlike the ranchera, where you really have a great singer, in the corrido, these are kind of everyday people that just want to talk about other everyday people. So there are corridos about revolutionaries like Pancho Villa and Zapata and so forth. And they're really kind of very, well, how do you say it? Like a very uh, standard song, right? It kind of repeats itself in its chorus and its verses. So it's not very complicated. Again, I'll show you an example of that. The singer might not be the greatest singer. The example I'm going to show you, it's almost nauseating, like his voice. But these are what we call border ballads that talk about life in the northern Mexican region, the border region. And in the last maybe 40 years, we really have seen the increase of what's called a narco corrido, where they talk about, drugs, really the transferring of drugs from Mexico into the United States. So again, there you see that border region. And then, some of the drug traffickers. And in the last, and there's a documentary on Netflix for a while that talked about how many people living on this side of the border are composing the narco corridos. Again, very simplistic song in their structure, but this is something that many of you are probably familiar with, that genre of music. Another example is music from Texas, right? This is very folky. All these are maybe, this is Canción Ranchera is very mainstream. Corridos are very kind of folky. Obviously now they're mass produced. So again, challenging those categories. Música Tejana, again, very folky. Most of you are probably not familiar with this singer over here. But, it's a product of the U.S.-Mexican War and the experiences thereafter. So you have a lot of conjuntos where they use accordions, ensembles that was introduced by Polish and German immigrants and Czech immigrants that migrated to the northern Mexican region. You also have the introduction of guitar, as you see over here, and the bajo sexto, which is the bass. So again, I'll put some examples. This is from the 1940s. Sounds almost like a country song, very sad, almost depressing song. But then you have, again, very folky, but by the 1990s, you have something that becomes very mass produced with the Johnny Canales show, a very kind of regional show in Texas that hosted a lot of Tex-Mex musicians. Freddie Fender, probably one of the biggest stars of this genre, but one that you're probably more familiar with is Selena, right? She took it to a whole different level and really made it popular. Obviously her death played a role in that too. Another genre, no, I don't say genre, but another kind of style is that kind of West Coast style of Chicano music. This is definitely influenced by Mexican culture and the Chicano movement. So even pre 1960s, pre Chicano movement, you have musicians such as Richie Valens, who did rock and roll, right? That's what he wanted to play. That's what he produced. But he also has elements of folk music with La Bamba, right? La Bamba is a very folk song from Mexico, which he made it into a very mainstream song on his records. Actually, wasn't very popular in the 1950s, and it's not until the 1980s where it became probably one of the most popular songs from a Mexican American community. In the 1970s, you have the Chicano movement kind of influence a new generation of Mexican American performers. So one of them is Malo, who, again, I'll put an example there, but they take elements of almost like Spanish jazz and make it into an American style of music, right? So they blend a lot of Latin instruments, Afro American instruments, melodies into a new genre of their own. And, they even include Spanglish into their music. So their most popular song is Suavecito, right? It's a Spanish song. But it's mostly sung in English, but it has elements here and there of Spanish words. By the 1990s, you have a new genre. This is mostly from Latin America, but does influence Mexican American youth. So this is rock en español, and there's a lot of groups in this category, and it's hard to kind of classify as to a particular style, but they're heavily influenced by 80s new wave, obviously just rock and roll music from the United States. Um, Depeche Mode, right? The synthesizer. And you have groups like Maná, Enanitos Verdes, Maldita Vecindad. It's just a large uh, number of musicians who are producing rock en español. And you also have Mexican Americans doing some of this music. I know there's a movie called Was Up Rockers? Not a great movie, but they have a lot of this type of music in part of the soundtrack. In the 2000s, around maybe 10 years ago from this lecture, 2015, you have a group called Chicano Batman, and they can really kind of stand out because they do music, a lot of kind of conjunto music. They're influenced by people like Los Bukis, any group with Los, right? Los Solitarios is like Mexican music from the 70s. Los Freddys, I think they actually did a song of Los Freddys. And they kind of put their own twist on it and make their own genre. Now, this is music that many of us are not familiar with, has not really gone mainstream, but definitely they are producing, Chicanos are still producing their own music today. So again, this is from around 2015, but they're still producing music even as we speak. There's a lot of singers out there. I just can't think of them right now. What are their names? Quetzal is one of them. Oh God, some of them are from East LA, like Chicano Batman again from LA, and the Sinceres, another kind of great band out there that are doing Chicano music right now. Again, they don't get the mainstream success that maybe some African American artists will get or white American artists will get. And then you have another group right here that I really like. They're called the Lakesiders, and they do kind of very soulful music, definitely influenced by Afro American music from the 1960s. And again, I'll play a sample. I'll post a sample so you can listen to it. But it's a very soulful song, very, they look like 1940s pachucos and pachucas. And they have a very kind of old soul sound to them, very kind of great music. They also do covers too, so of kind of Mexican songs or even Tex-Mex type songs. But these are just kind of samples of Chicano music. I'm sure there's a lot that I left out that you probably are familiar with, but these are just some examples of what we can kind of categorize as Chicano music, going back to our Mexican roots to stuff that might be a little bit more contemporary today. Let's look at another example of Chicano art. This is called poster art. I won't spend too much time on this, but as you can see, these are posters, right? That's what they were. That's what they were used for. There were posters to promote an event. And eventually, something that's, I don't want to say folk, but it's not something that's really for mass production, becomes high art, right? Its purpose was to tell you about an event that was taking place at a specific place and who was going to speak and at what time, and if you want information, and it's going to be free, to something that becomes its own style of art, right? So here you see, again, that's an event back in the day, right? 40, 50 years ago, to something that's much more refined, has definitely a much more political message, and it's based off a product that you're familiar with, right? The raisin product, right? When you go buy raisins, and this is part of the Chicano movement, right? Dealing with the grapes and probably Cesar Chavez, that it takes an image that mainstream society is familiar with and makes it into art, but also has a very political message, right? Addressing how the raisins that you're eating or the grapes that you're eating could possibly kill you because of toxics and stuff like that. So again, this is a great example of something that starts off as very folk culture, eventually becomes high culture, because this is something that would hang in the museum, right? Yeah, only so much of this was produced, and it has a very political message. So you need to know that kind of context to understand what this art is all about, what's its message, right? So it's breaking down those barriers of high, folk, low, and mass culture. The next example that I want to address is lowriders. So lowriders, one scholar has noted that it actually originates pre-car culture. So it is from the outgrowth of what he termed the paseo. So in the 18th century, 1700s, 1800s, men would wear, their best clothing, and they would have these decorated horses, and they would um, ride their horses through the center of town to attract the opposite sex, right? They dressed to impress. They would decorate their horses and with their fancy saddles and ribbons, and then also demonstrate their impressive riding skills in order, to attract attention from women, more or less, right? And one scholar said that this is the connection between low riding and Mexican culture. So the paseo is just something that you would do, to get attention, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? Because that's what kind of lowriders do, right? You dress up your car, you make it all fancy in order to get attention, right? So again, the origins are with horses and 1700s, 1800s. But when it comes to low riding, we see that it actually, particularly with cars, it goes back to the 1930s for Mexican Americans. And what they're doing is taking a product that's really for mass consumption, right? Part of mass culture, cars. And they're really there to get you from point A to point B, so you can drive around, so transport you from one place to another. And you take a product that's really for mass consumption and you make it into something that's yours. You personalize it. So scholars have noted that low riding actually goes back to the 1930s. One thing that they would do is that they take cars from the 30s. 1930s is the Great Depression, so a lot of Mexican Americans would buy used cars, and they would lower their cars by using sacks of sand or concrete and place them in the trunk, so the back of it would go a little bit lower, right? And this is definitely connected to Mexican American culture, because we find that, particularly in California, it became, the cars become synonymous with the state. So not only are Mexican Americans, consuming cars, but all Americans, right, are consuming cars, because that's the only way you can travel in a place like Los Angeles and really California. In places like New York, you just take the subway, right? So car culture really begins to explode in California and particularly Los Angeles, where it becomes almost like the second Detroit. By the 1940s and 50s, we see that Mexican Americans would weld the suspension springs to lower their cars. So many Mexican Americans in the 1940s actually joined World War II, and in doing so, they learned a lot of great skills that they would not have learned had the war not taken place. So by going into the military, they learn all these important skill sets on tanks, on planes, and they bring that skill set when they get out of the military, and they bring it into their cars. So in the 1940s, the cars become affordable. So many of them buy kind of used cars, and they play around with them, right? They tinker with them, like other Americans were tinkering with their cars too, with like hot rods. And in doing so, they create their like car groups, and they kind of use these skills and perfect it, and they would trade their skills amongst their car groups, right? So somebody knew how to weld, somebody knew how to paint, somebody knew how to repair an engine, and they would do these trades, right? You work on my engine, and I'll work on your upholstery. So the military in World War II played a very important role in bringing in this car culture amongst Mexican Americans. By the 1950s, we really see the flourishing, again, not just in the Mexican American community, but all throughout the throughout California, the emergence of car clubs, where again, people in places like Los Angeles develop clubs such as the Honey Drippers, the Pandragons, and the Cutouts. And really by the late 1950s is where you see hydraulics take off. Hydraulics is really credited to Ron Aguirre, who was the first to use hydraulics on a Corvette. And the hydraulics actually came from the wing of a B-52 bomber. So again, that military knowledge was repurposed into something that they could implement into their car, right? So again, here you see a great example of a 59 Impala that straight out of the Chevrolet company. It's a car. You use it to drive you around, basically, right? And Chicanos make it into an art form. So again, challenging those categories of high, low, and folk culture, where something that's very folky in regards to the Mexican American community is now kind of widespread everywhere, not just in places like California, but it ventured into other communities, African American community. It went to to Japan. You see Anglo Americans also participating in this. But you also see another important group that I want to touch on, which is women. Let's hope this is the video.
A lot of people argue about the origins of lowriding. What we can agree upon is that lowriding begins in the Mexican American experience in the southwestern part of the United States.
Now remember, during World War II, Detroit is not making new cars, right? Because Detroit has shifted to wartime production. So after the war, right, returning veterans, they get a little bit of money to buy cars, right? Also, there's a turnover in secondhand cars because people after the war want new cars. So I think what's really interesting about lowriding is that you're sort of taking sort of these secondhand cars and turning it into something beautiful.
Because older cars, nobody wanted them. Everybody wanted the new cars. So old cars, you could get an old car for like $300. And we would just modify them a little, put rims, lower them down. And
the hydraulics came because we used to lower these cars because it was just cool. And the law was you couldn't have a lowered car. So they would have it so that they would lift them up so they can be legal and then drop them down so they can be party. You know what I'm saying?
There was a surplus of aircraft parts and the hydraulic lifts, so it just took the ingenuity and mechanical know-how to install those on a car in order to be able to raise up to a legal ride height.
I think the only, culture that is identified by our cars, where you see a car that's a 64 Impala with Virgen de Guadalupe airbrushed on it, or the pinstriping on the side, and you go, that's Chicano culture on wheels.
When you customize a car, the whole goal is for you to assert your individuality. You can have 10 64 Impalas lined up, and they're all going to be different.
So yeah, that video is about the origins of low riding, right? But I do want to show you this other video of women. But before I show that, I want to address again, this is a work of art. This takes a lot of talent to do. Some of these cars are not even driven because there's so much chrome that, they take them to car shows on the trailer. And it's really to showcase, right? And it's accessible to everybody because those that are driven on the boulevard, everybody gets to experience them once, they park them and you can check them out. So this is a form of fine art, right? High culture, challenging those categories of Western society. So even though this is a very male-dominated community, we have seen women partake in it and not just, drape on these cars, but as builders.
Together with my mom in her car, it always felt like no one else mattered, nothing else mattered. It was just us all together, pure love, having a good time. My mom was a young mom, and me, my brother, and my sister were all a year apart. So if you can imagine, you have these little kids, 3, 4, 5-year-olds with a 18, 19-year-old in the car, driving this boat. If anybody knows the 77 Monte Carlo, those things are boats. She not only taught us about low riding, cruising around, being with your family, but she also taught us about defying the odds. She went back to school. She got a college degree. She was an accountant. For a young mother, having 3 children, Chicana, she instilled that in us always, to be proud of who we are, family first, always be loyal and take care of your family no matter what, like my mom did. My mom sacrificed everything for us. Sometimes I would feel like kind of deterred of being in low riding, but I always thought back to my mom, she loved low riding. She was always out there no matter what. Dueñas came about in June of 2019. We all love low riding. We've all been riding together. We're all females. We thought that it would be fitting for us to start our own all-female car club. Dueñas means the female owner in Spanish. We wanted people to know that these are our cars. They're owned by women.
I am the youngest member of Dueñas Car Club. I've been riding with all of them since I was younger. Going into a male-dominated hobby where everyone's perception of women is they don't agree with us driving our cars, they don't agree with women in low riding to begin with. I feel like it's really empowering for younger girls, for older women, for women all around to know that we're able to do something just as equal as men are.
We're Duanitas and we're from Dueñas Car Club. Yeah!
I recently joined Dueñas in January of this year. It meant a lot to me to join a club that was all females because I've always had that passion. I've had my car for 8 years now. So it was important to belong to a bunch of females and not just be kind of the outcast of the men's club. She's already saying she's going to get my car later on down the road, and she'll continue the love for low riding and be out there for many, many years.
So we give back to the community. We do fundraisers. We know what it's like. We're in the Hispanic community. Sometimes, there's a lot of poverty. Sometimes, we have parents my grandparents worked in the field who didn't have all the money to buy the nice things and buy this and that. So why not give back and help others? I think that's something that us Chicanos need to do, is help better unite and give back to our own people. I want it to be about women empowerment, because if it wasn't for my mom telling me to always be proud of who I was and do what I wanted to do no matter what, I wouldn't be where I am today. My friends have a lot to do with who I am as well. The girls in the club, all of us, we're all very strong-minded women. We teach our daughters, our sisters, everybody that you can do no matter what you want to do in life. If it's graduating high school, small things, just wanting to play softball and thinking that you don't have that skill, you don't have that talent, you can do it. You can do it. Don't give up on your dreams.
So those are, again, women who are partaking in this culture, again, not just as ornaments, but as actual builders of these cars, which, again, the lowriding culture has always been seen as very sexist, and we see a shift happening in the last 20 plus years. These are just, again, some other examples of lowriders. Right here, right, you see so much chrome, all that paint work. If you ever worked on a car, I worked on a Mustang once. It's a lot of work, and these type of cars, it is a work of art, right? Challenging the notion that this does not fit in the museum. I mean, you could go to, I know, the downtown Phoenix auto show every November. They always have lowriders on display there, and it's like going to a museum, right? You're looking at these cars, you're checking them out, checking the amount of work. Sometimes they have pictures on them, and you have to try to think, what are these things about, right? What are they talking about? What's the message, and so forth. So these things definitely are folk, low, mass, and high culture. So let's look at Chicano literature. We're not going to talk about every every book, but we're going to highlight some of the major literary texts. There's a lot out there and I'm going to leave some things out, but I just want you to look at some of the major Chicano literature texts that have come out, particularly after the Chicano movement. Prior to that period, there really isn't something that we could probably call Chicano literature. There is a book published by Maria Amparo Ruiz at Burton, which I believe came out like in the late 1800s, that talks about life after post U.S.-Mexico War and what the squatters went through. Aside from that, I can't really think of another Chicano novel that might fall somewhere after that period or before the 1960s. So we're going to start by looking, or at least quickly addressing, Jose Antonio Villarreal's book called Pocho. It is said that he wrote it in 1956 and wasn't able to publish until 1959. And understand this is a time where many felt that there really wasn't a market for Mexican American literature. And his book, it definitely reflects the Mexican American experience, particularly the way we have covered it in this class. The story addresses the migration of the main character's father from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And he migrates to California in order to kind of get out of that conflict, but also, for job opportunities. And while here, he has a son, and this son kind of struggles with his identity living in the United States. So this book, to some extent, reflects that Mexican American experience of the 1930s of not quite sure whether you are fully Mexican because his parents are very proud, kind of very traditional family, while at the same time he's growing up in the United States, kind of acknowledging his individuality, which might conflict with his parents' expectations. So this book kind of reflects those values, which is what makes it very significant. It's a very kind of straightforward novel. If you read it, it's one of these books that you have to read in Chicano literature. Another important book is by John Recchi, who published his first novel. I have 64 here, but I saw somewhere else that says 63, called The City of Night. He also wrote another book called Sexual Outlaw, and his books really kind of focus on gay identity, which is very novel for this period, because it actually predates the gay rights movement of the later part of the 1960s with Stonewall. So it was quite risky to write about this subject, and from what I read, it actually did really well. So he talks a lot about cruising, right? Obviously, being in relationships with other men, and it was quite taboo for that era. And now it has become an important book in Chicano literature. Now, understand that you see the last name, right? Rechi. His mom was Mexican American, I believe, and the father was Euro American. So somehow he's become part of the Chicano canon. Another important text is Corky Gonzalez's Yo Soy Joaquin. If you recall, Corky Gonzalez was an activist from Denver. To some extent, kind of led the Chicano movement, started the Chicano movement with that conference in Denver. There he wrote this very, I believe the video actually talked about it, right? He read the poem Yo Soy Joaquin, which explores Mexican American identity within the United States, but does like this historical connection with the past, acknowledging our indigenous past, but also our European connection, right? He kind of talks about how we are the conqueror and the conquered, and it's one of these major literary texts that you have to read in Chicano literature and Chicano studies. So you can go to YouTube and get a copy of it, or sorry, not get a copy, but listen to it. It's a very epic poem. Another important text is Rodolfo Anaya. His book called Bless Me Ultima, you might have already read it. Is a very important book that focuses on life in New Mexico, I believe in the 1940s after the World War. And like Pocho, it's a coming of age story where a young boy is emerging, is growing up, kind of like in the outskirts of a, like an open land or like a farmer, and he's again conflicted with his identity. But he has like somebody to guide him. This curandera named Ultima comes and lives with a family, and she kind of guides the young boy. I think his name is Antonio, because he's a young little boy, and he learns a lot from her. It's really about acknowledging the indigenous past. Now, what makes this story very unique is this element called magical realism. So, magical realism is an element, a literary element that comes from Latin American writers. So, Garcia Marquez, who wrote Cien Años de Soledad, probably the most prominent writer, to some extent started this literary technique called magical realism. And just to give you somewhat of a definition, it's a literary technique where reality and fantasy meet with little explanation. There is no explanation of how the magic and fantasy come about, but rather it is just accepted. Just to give you a quick example, the character Ultima, who's a curandera, also becomes an owl, right? And a lot of times as a reader, you're like, well, how did that happen, right? Was there some kind of issue, a magician, or is there some kind of potion that she drinks or something like that? And in magical realism, that's never really explained how this transition happens. You just accept it. So many people have described it almost like being a dream. Not that the story is a dream, but if you think of the dreams that you have where you're transported from one part of the world to the other, and right, that's never really explained. You just, you're in Santa Barbara and then you end up over here in Phoenix. And how did that happen? You don't know, but you open the door and you're in Phoenix or whatever it may be. So that's what magical realism kind of is. If you ever seen the movie Life of Pi, they actually use magical realism. I believe it's this guy in a boat with all these animals, and you're probably thinking, how is it these animals don't kill each other, right? Being in a small little boat. So that would be an element of magical realism. Never really explained, but it just happens. So anyways, Bless Me Ultima, it's a very significant book. It's something that you have to read in Chicano literature. Besides magical realism, it really kind of touches on the indigenous past, kind of questioning Western beliefs, Western religion, and really taking it upon the main character to find himself and a lot of it's through Ultima, who represents this kind of indigenous past in New Mexico. And I'm going to end this section at least talking about women writers. You really see women become very significant or come out with very significant novels in the 1980s, such as Sandra Cisneros, who wrote House on Mango Street. Like Bless Me Ultima and Pocho, this is a coming of age story too. A young girl who is exploring not only her community but her identity. It's a book that has many short stories in them, and what kind of really separates her from, say, these previous people that I talked about is that she explores subjects that are very personal, such as not only sexuality but heterosexism, right? Things that are very personal that impact the main character. Um, so it's a book that many of you probably already read, like in high school. So it's a book that I highly recommend. It's a quick read because it's all little stories, little short stories that you could read fairly quickly. And the last one I want to address is Gloria Zaldúa, Borderlands, which we sort of read a section from her in the first week because I want to at least expose you to her literature. And her book, it's not really literature like these other stories, which is kind of fiction stories, even though they might have a hint of autobiography. Her book, Borderlands, it's one of these major books that transforms the field of Chicano studies. So, Borderlands is autobiographical. It's a spiritual journey, a theoretical work, an expository essay, mixing genres in a way that serves her purpose to instruct, challenge, scandalize, and provide her reader, not allowing her to be labeled. So um, when we read this literature, you saw that it had poetry. It went from Spanish to English, which a lot of students don't like, right? Like just write it in English. It had history, it had anthropology, it had sociology, it had theoretical critique, right? Um, it it had a lot of symbolism when it talked about the border, not just being a line between two countries, but also being a physical place on the body, particularly her body. So Gloria Zaldúa, just completely changes the game when it comes to Chicano. Um, I want to say literature, but again, her book cannot really be labeled as literature. It's a major theoretical work that anybody in the field has to read, and even people outside the field have kind of quoted her because it's become such an important book outside of Chicano studies. All right, so these are just some few examples. There's a lot more that unfortunately we just don't have the time to explore, but hopefully take a Chicano novel class and read some of these books. So lastly, let's look at Chicano art, and here specifically we're going to be looking at muralism. Since to some extent, I don't want to say that Chicanos brought it back from the dead, but yeah, they did, right? Because this was essentially a dead art by the 1930s after the Great Depression. And, art becomes very privatized in the 1900s, where you can only really see art in museums. So Chicano took an art form that was essentially dead and brought it back to life. As I just mentioned, there's a great tradition, not only in Western culture, but also in American history, where muralism became an important art form. So, in regards to the kind of major Mexican muralists, during the Great Depression, the federal government did pay or grant, I guess, provided grants for artists to do murals throughout the United States. So it wasn't just the Mexican artists, but also American artists who were invited to do murals. If you go to places like San Francisco, Chicago, and so forth, you'll see a lot of murals. So it was a popular form of art for a short window in the 1930s where you have these great artists, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Clemente Orozco, who were commissioned to do art in throughout the United States, either through the government or through private enterprise. Rockefeller, for example, paid Rivera to do a mural that they eventually whitewashed. But nevertheless, there's a tradition of this art form that Chicanos are influenced by. So there's actually a great mural by Siqueiros in Placita Olvera in downtown Los Angeles that for many years I was actually looking for it and I could never find it because I didn't know where it was at. I thought it was at like eye level. But if you ever are down by Placita Olvera, they actually restored it a couple years ago, maybe a decade ago, and you can walk up some steps and it's above the Italian Hall in Placita Olvera, and you could see the mural, which is very interesting because when he was commissioned, I believe by the city, they gave him a subject that would not be very controversial, and he made it controversial. Now, many of these artists were either communists or definitely, you know, I guess politically they were, I guess what we would call today radicals, but a lot of them were just advocating for social justice. So Chicanos are heavily influenced by their style, so much so that some of them actually train with these famous muralists. So you have people like Siqueiros, who worked with Chicano artists later in his life, and they took on this art form in the 1960s. So Los Tres Grandes, they focus on kind of revolutionary topics, particularly against addressing indigenous themes, and touch on the history of colonization, along with elements of Marxism. So for many Chicanos, they found this art form as kind of reaffirming their culture, but also rejecting bourgeois values, and really helped promote, by the 1960s, this concept of cultural nationalism. So this revived this art form in places like East Los Angeles. So in many barrios, we see the beginning of muralism in like housing projects. So here are some from the Boyle Heights housing projects. Some of them have been seen in I guess popular music videos. I think the Black Eyed Peas have this mural in one of their videos. I think because one of them grew up in this housing community. It's like there's like public government funded housing. And many of them were not actually artists in the sense that they were professionally trained or anything like that. Many of them just had whatever artistic skills they developed, had a bucket of paint, and everybody in the community help do some of these murals. So they might look a little bit elementary, but it doesn't really matter because what they did is made art accessible to their community. Remember that art is being privatized during the 1900s. So this is a way to make art accessible, challenging, again, that notion of high, low, folk, and mass categories that we talked at the beginning of the lecture. Other ways that we see Chicano art flourish is through activism. So there's an example of Chicano Park, and I'll quickly play a short video, which is also a music video, but explores what happens at Chicano Park in San Diego, where they were going to put a police station after they had all these freeways, that they built these freeways in the Mexican American community of Logan Heights. And Chicanos were kind of tired, like, we don't need more police, we need a community center, if you will. So they built a park, they grabbed their shovels and whatever skills they had, and they made a community center by developing this park. And in doing so, because it's right underneath the freeway pillars, they had all this kind of blank canvases, right, in public space. And they put all these murals that today it's a very important site, not just to Chicanos, but to the history of California. So I quickly want to play the music video, but it briefly explains the history of what happened there. So there you see the freeways that were built in the Chicano community. You know, houses were torn down, kind of broke up the neighborhood.
In the year 1970, the city of San Diego, under the Coronado Bridge, lied a little piece of land. A piece of land that the community of Logan Heights wanted to make into a park. A park where all the chavalitos could come and play in, so they wouldn't have to play in the street anymore and get run over by a car. A park where all the viejitos could come and just sit down and watch the sun go down in the tarde. A park where all the familias could come and just get together on a Sunday afternoon and celebrate the spirit of life itself. But the city of San Diego said, Chale, we're gonna make a highway patrol substation here, man. So on April the 22nd, 1970, La Raza of Logan Heights and other Chicano communities of San Diego got together and they organized and they walked on the land and they took it over with their picks and their shovels and they began to build their park. And today, that little piece of land under the Coronado Bridge is known to everybody as Chicano Park. It began in 19...
So there's the you know, it's part of a song. It's a Chicano kind of like activist song that addresses what happened there. So again, I just wanted to play you a small sample. And Chicano Park, like I said, very important space for Mexican Americans, and now it's a historical site. Now, when it comes to Chicano muralism and really Chicano art, they utilize this element called rascuachismo. So you might have heard this term, rascuache, right? Maybe your mom or your dad might use this term to, you know, call things that they feel is rascuache, something that's kind of trashy or something like that. Now, Chicanos have used that element, that word, to describe their art form. Not so much that their art is trash, but they kind of turn it on its head, saying challenging, you know, the virtues of or at least definition, the virtues of opposing the refined finished product of bourgeois art with unpolished vitality. So this is what Chicanos bring to this new art form. Basically, what this is saying is that like I said earlier, most of these artists were not professional artists, but rather just, you know, community members who wanted art, who wanted to beautify their neighborhood by putting art that would be accessible to the public. So much of their art is not only not done by professionals. Eventually, it does. You know, you do have professional artists come in and do some of these murals, but originally they didn't. And then a lot of it has to do with social causes, which is what we see here, right? We are not a minority, addressing indigenous history or religious cultural motifs. That's right there. So between 1968 and 1970 is when we see the rise of muralism. So this is an art form that was essentially dead, that is revived by Chicano artists. And within these murals, they have a lot of kind of religious symbolism, indigenous motifs, political and social issues, addressing things like that reflect the barrio culture, right? You need to be part of the neighborhood, certain texts that reference the neighborhood. So maybe your grandma or grandpa has a tattoo between their thumb and their index finger that has a C/S, which means consafos, which means with respect, right? And again, this is symbolism and terminology that you would only know if you grew up in the barrio, right? It could have elements of graffiti, family legends, right? Indigenous legends and so forth. So that early period, again, was reflecting the politics of the era with the rise of the Chicano movement. So it's not just a political movement, but it's also an artistic movement. By the 1970s, you really begin to push the boundaries of art, where you see a lot of Chicanos go to college, get their degree, their art degree, and they're professional artists, and they address topics of transnational themes, or topics that were um, very kind of intellectual, again challenging that high culture, low culture category, because you do need some kind of intellect to understand some of these murals, right? So uh, Chicano muralism really kind of pushes those boundaries. And I quickly want to go through a few murals. I won't talk about them extensively, but just want to expose you to some of them. So here we have some 1970s mural addressing like family life, really kind of challenging this notion of assimilation, right? This guy's being brainwashed, and they're sitting there watching their American TV, and then you have an indigenous figure coming down, enlightening this young boy about their indigenous past. Another one over here, we see La Familia, just the typical Mexican American family being like everybody else, right? Kind of indicating, hey, we're no different from anybody else. We like music, we like sports, we work, we take care of our home, we celebrate our culture, and we do art, right? Just like any other American family. So yeah, we're Mexican American, but we're still American. This mural right here kind of you should know it because it actually addresses what things that we covered in this class, such as the Mexican Revolution, which causes migration to the United States, right? The factories are also trying to bring cheap labor into the United States. This part of the mural addresses Mexican American involvement in World War II. At the same time that's going on, you have the Zoot Suit riots and just the Zoot Suit movement, right? The subculture of East Los Angeles. And then over here we have the civil rights movement with Brown Berets, Corky Gonzalez. I'm not sure who this is. Kind of looks like Bert Corona, but I'm not sure. Cesar Chavez and the UFW, Reis Tijerina, and so forth, right? So this mural right here, again going with those elements of high, low, and folk, could be an element of high culture because you have to have that intellect development to understand what's happening here. And since you're taking my class, you could probably piece this together as teaching you Chicano history through art, right? So it has a social message. Here we have, again, other murals. This is not a mural, but it's something called Pinto art. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Chicano tattoos. Well, a Chicano style of tattoo comes from the prison system, right? These guys do some phenomenal art, and they have their own style. Here are some women muralists. By 1970s, you have women doing murals, right? Kind of addressing topics that are important to them. This is another important mural. Wherever there's open space, right, they do their murals. This one, I believe the story goes that the artist's brother or some relative died in this area, so it's kind of addressing those issues. La Ofrenda, looking at Chicana activists from the UFW, so Dolores Huerta, right, in homage to her. This looks like to be like an underpass. And then I want to kind of highlight this one because in the as I mentioned, right, muralism was essentially dead, but the Chicanos kind of bring it back. And in the 1980s, when the Olympics took place, LA wanted to show the world, that, yeah, we're going to have the games here, but there's something special about Los Angeles. So what they do is they actually commission different artists. One of them is actually a Chicano artist who does this one right here, going to the Olympics. And this is off the 101 freeway. Placita Alvera is right over here. Union Station, you can see it right there, right? I believe over here you had the old Chinatown. Now that the freeway is there, the Chinatown doesn't exist anymore. At least this Chinatown. There is another one over here. But anyways, this mural, this art format, essentially died. And now that LA wanted to showcase its culture to the world, it commissioned Chicanos to do murals throughout the freeways, making art accessible not just in the barrios, but to everybody who takes the 101, who's going from sporting event to sporting event, and they were able to see this art form as they were going to the next event. And understand that muralism is not just something for Chicanos. I mean, it's open to anybody, right? And again, it's challenging those concepts of high, low, and folk culture. But in the 1990s, you have artists such as Judith Baca, who did a lot of those physical murals. Also developed murals. I guess what we would call digital art, but they kind of have that mural element to it in cyberspace, right? Again, making it accessible to anybody who visits the page. And then you have other Chicana artists and Chicano artists who are kind of pushing the boundaries of challenging ideas of heterosexism by doing these images that are very familiar to us, such as La Virgen de Guadalupe, but then also putting over here an image that kind of replicates the women's anatomy. And Alma Lopez looking for inspiration to La Virgen de Guadalupe, but instead of putting her in a very passive role, puts her in a very empowering role, as you can see in this digital mural over here. So I want to end this by saying, showing you how Chicanos express themselves. Yes, we're American, but we also have a very unique culture that might go against mainstream culture, right? So the Chicano movement really helps bring about this, what we call Chicano Renaissance, out and accessible to other people that have not been exposed to this culture, right? Through literature, through music, through art. And much of this cultural self-expression is done to reaffirm their cultural background, right? Using motifs that they're familiar with, talking about barrio culture, having their own unique style, or maybe a style that is connected to their historical past through their parents. So a lot of it was to reaffirm their culture. And significantly, as I try to show you, is that much of this was to challenge the Western perception of how art is perceived, that there is such a thing as high, low, and folk culture. Quite the opposite, right? Hopefully what I try to show you is that Chicano art challenges those Western categories of high, low, folk, and mass culture, that something like Chicano music or Chicano muralism can break those boundaries of these categories and fit into all these elements, right? So there is no dichotomy that you must choose one over the other. Quite the opposite. As we saw with lowriders, it's art that's accessible to everybody, and it's beautiful art. Or the murals where you need that kind of intellectual background to decipher an image that's out in public, right? So it breaks down those barriers. And then lastly, it challenges those ideas that there is only one America, right? There are many Americas, and each culture, each group, each class, right, expresses their culture in their own unique way, right? Even white Americans, don't have a homogenous culture, right? You go to West Virginia and they have their own culture amongst Anglo-Americans that might differ from some Anglo-Americans in New York, right? So Chicanos are no different. We are challenging what is America by showing you alternative ways to look at not only art but identity too. All right, so we'll end it there, and I hope you feel like you learned something new.